Hello, it's Ruby, and today I'm going to be filming one of my favourite videos of the year, my roundup of books that I read in 2022. I filmed one of these every year since 2015, 16, and it's always very good fun. So I'm going to get Goodreads up, and I'm not going to talk about every book for a very long time. It's not going to be full reviews. I'll say a little bit about every book, like a bit of a summary and whether I would recommend it, but I'm not going to talk about each book for too long because otherwise this video will be really long. In 2022, I tried to read 120 books, but I fell just short of this. I read 117 books, which obviously is still a lot. It's slightly frustrating to have been that close to my goal and not completed it, but I was ill for the last week of 2022, basically sleeping for 5 solid days. I think I would have completed the challenge if I hadn't been ill, but sometimes things happen which mean that things just can't go to plan. They can't work out how you hope that they would, and that's okay. If, like me, you didn't read as many books as you wanted to read this year, obviously that is okay, and I just want to stress that. Also, annoyingly, some of these books I didn't put dates for, and so if you know how Goodreads works, it puts the ones without dates right at the bottom here. I'll come back to those at the end. I started the year by reading Selected Letters of Lewis Carroll, and I ended up writing my dissertation on Lewis Carroll's letters, and so there are a lot of books related to Lewis Carroll, as you can imagine. I only included academic books and texts if I read the entirety of them. Obviously there were lots of essays and like selections from particular academic books that I would have read for my degree, but I only included them if I read all of it. So Selected Letters of Lewis Carroll is not the complete letters of Lewis Carroll, which I also read. The complete letters is roughly 4,000, 5,000 letters, which Cohen put together and collated in the 1970s. This is of upwards of 98,000 letters, which Lewis Carroll actually wrote, so it's a tiny, tiny pin drop of the full compendium of letters that he had, but these are the only ones that he was able to locate, and actually locating that many is a massive feat because he wrote letters to so many people and they were scattered all over the place. But the Selected Letters of Lewis Carroll is definitely worth reading if you are just interested to read some of his letters. It's about 200 pages and it collates some of the best ones, and they're grouped into types of letter as opposed to chronologically like the larger Cohen collection. They're very interesting. You also see such an overlap between Carroll's letters and then his published fiction. A lot of what I argued in my dissertation is that there is an overlap between those two things. When Carroll writes a book or he writes a short story, he seems to be addressing it in part to a particular child that he knows. Next, The Art of War by Sun Chui, which I didn't like. I'm sure you can read it metaphorically and allegorically, but I was expecting for it to be more allegorical than it was. I thought that I'd be able to use it as a book of philosophy and wisdom and learning, but I was surprised at how directly about war it was. It felt like it was entirely about war, an actual like tangible structural advice if you are conducting battle. But then my dad loved this book. I just didn't enjoy it and I felt like I didn't really gain anything from it. Next I read The Master Letters of Emily Dickinson. This is a collection of 3 letters which were found in Emily Dickinson's bedroom when she died, and they were all addressed to someone called Master. We don't know who this person was. These were only drafts of letters, they weren't the actual letters, but they seem to be of a kind of romantic sort, and just from reading them it seems like they are part of a much wider correspondence. And also when I read them it had an introduction which explained the Master Letters, main modes of scholarship and criticism on them, so that was really cool. I read A Short Treatise on Great Virtues by André Comte-Sponville. This was a recommendation from my dad again. It's a book of philosophy. It's all about making philosophy more accessible and how you can apply it to your own life. So it takes arguments from the great philosophers. So you've got Plato in there, Descartes, Sartre, and in particular it's concerned with questions about what it means to live a good life and what virtues are. And this isn't armchair philosophy. It's not trying to be super clever and trying to be inaccessible, which sometimes I think philosophy books can do. It's actually practically useful, and if you haven't read much philosophy before, then this is a good one to start with. It's quite long, but it's also not particularly difficult. So then these two books are ones that I read for university before term started. So I read The Life of Our Lord, written for his children during the years 1846 and 1849 by Charles Dickens. And I read this for an essay that I was writing on Charles Dickens. So Charles Dickens was actually a very strong Christian, but very specifically committed to Jesus's philosophy. He saw Jesus as the greatest moral teacher and encouraged his children to see the same. So this is a book that he wrote of the life of Jesus, which he then gave to his children. And I mean, I was reading it in an academic sense, so it was semi-interesting in that capacity because I was using it to understand his theological beliefs, but I wouldn't recommend reading it just for fun because it is quite dry. It's not like Dickens's usual style. And then I read Vanities of the Eye, Vision in Early Modern European Culture, which was so good. This was so fascinating. I did an early modern module in 2021, like in that final term. I kept on making a note that I wanted to learn more about early modern eyesight and ideas of blindness, the metaphysical quality of the eye, because eyes represented so much. The book did not disappoint. It's the leading book on like eyesight in early modern England. It talks about things like apparitions and spirits, like the medical nature of eyes, and I also like how it applies it to early modern literature. So there were a lot of philosophical questions going around about like whether you can trust what you see, what senses you can trust, which is definitely what Descartes' philosophy came out of. Next, I read The Nutcracker, and actually I read this book twice this year. I didn't realise that I read it in January too, but I just read it last week. It's by E.T.A. Hoffmann, of course, and the original story is very different to the story of the ballet, the one that we kind of know best today. It always just makes me feel very festive, and it's a very quick read. It doesn't take me very long. I read 8 or 9 Wise Words About Letter Writing by Lewis Carroll again. This is a satirical etiquette guide that Lewis Carroll wrote about letter writing. Very short, but very amusing, and I think gives a great insight into Victorian letter writing cultures, and most importantly, what Lewis Carroll thought about them. Next, one of the best books that I read this year was Poison for Breakfast by Lemony Snicket. I love Lemony Snicket. He is one of my favourite writers, like definitely in the top 3. I just think he's so clever, so witty. I always love reading him, and Poison for Breakfast is, I would say it's an adult book instead of a children's book, although it could be enjoyed by both. It's narrated by the author / character Lemony Snicket, who at the beginning of the book is told that he has ingested poison at breakfast. So the whole of the book is him going through each thing that he ate for breakfast and then trying to find where the poison came from. So more than anything, it's an exercise in thinking and discovery, and not much really happens. There isn't much of a plot, but I think that's fantastic because it really lets you revel in the writing style of Lemony Snicket and his just like way of thinking, which I think is so unique. I also read Child's Eye by Steve Tizane. This is narrated by a boy in a refugee camp. It's a book for children, and it does a really great job of humanising people in refugee camps. The narrator is one of several undocumented children who aren't with their families, and they don't have any record or even names, so each of them is given a letter. And this book is narrated by Child's Eye. So his letter is I, that's what he's called. This makes for a really clever narrative where when he's narrating it himself, he's saying, I did this, I did that. That could also have been written in the third person. Next, I read The Christian Life, Its Courses, Its Hindrances and Its Helps by Thomas Arnold. Thomas Arnold was the headmaster of Rugby School, and this is a book that he wrote about how to be Sorry, the audio cut out. It's a book that he wrote about how to be a good Christian. So to read this because Thomas Arnold, if you didn't know, played a really influential role in education reform. He was the headmaster of Rugby School, and his policies at the school had a massive impact on other boys' public schools. Next, one book I loved was Fierce Bad Rabbits, The Tales Behind Children's Picture Books by Claire Pollard, which gives a history of children's picture books. Obviously, it goes through chronologically, and each of the chapters is dedicated to a different, very seminal, important children's book. The Tiger Who Came to Tea, I loved the bit on Beatrix Potter. It's kind of presented as an academic book, but I love how it's also very intimate, very personal, embedded with stories and remembrances of like reading these books to her children, having these books read to her. Before I keep on going and tell you the other books that I read this year, I just want to note that there are quite a few children's books that I read this year. I'm a staunch proponent of what C.S. Lewis said, which is that a children's book which cannot be enjoyed by adults too is not a good children's book. And I do enjoy reading children's books. There are children's books which are excellent, and I don't like how, as a culture, like societally, we do look down on children's books. We think of them not as being important, not as being worth reading, but I don't think that's true. And I am very adamant in saying that. Aside from that, I did a children's literature module at university, and so there were quite a lot of children's books I read for that. And also, I've been writing 2 children's books this year, and so I've been reading a lot of children's books just for market research. It's also already starting to get dark, so I probably will film some more of this video tomorrow. Alright, so for the children's books that I read quite a few of the series of Unfortunate Events book, and there are a lot of them that I read like half or 3/4 of but didn't finish, so I wouldn't have included them on my Goodreads roundup. I read The House at Pooh Corner by A.A. Milne, which I hadn't read since I was very young. My dad used to read these stories to my sister and I, and it was very nostalgic to reread it. And I think reading as an adult, I was so aware of how wise Winnie the Pooh is. My dad always said that he respected and like loved the philosophy of him, and never saw that when I was younger, but reading it now, I definitely do. Then, oh my gosh, this one I was really excited about. I used to love Jacqueline Wilson. I was obsessed with Jacqueline Wilson, and I read Opal Plumstead this year, which is a book about I think she's 14, and she becomes a suffragette. Edwardian period, when the suffragettes and suffragists were really fighting for women's suffrage. I think it's such a great introduction to this period and to this movement for young readers. I think Jacqueline Wilson's good at creating characters who are believable and who are flawed. Then I read Ottoline at Sea by Chris Riddell, which I never liked Ottoline that much when I was younger, but I loved this. It's so quirky, it's so funny. It's also very quick. A girl who mainly lives by herself with her friend Mr. Monroe, who is this hairy creature. Her parents are always away on holiday, so she has a lot of free reign and the freedom to do what she'd like. Then I read Billy and the Minpins by Roald Dahl, which I just never read when I was younger. I read The Woebegone Twins, which I didn't like. It was a little bit David Walliams Roald Dahl-esque, but I just didn't think it was that funny. The humour is all very slapstick. The Unauthorised Autobiography of Lemony Snicket. I love Lemony Snicket, as I say, so when I heard about this, I really wanted to read it. To be honest, I wasn't that impressed by it, and it's probably my least favourite thing I've read by him. It's the form of it's really cool. It has all of these like newspaper articles and different sources put side by side, and the idea is that you use them to unpick and better understand Lemony Snicket, but it's like an activity in doing so, so you become a detective to try and learn about him, because of course the whole idea of Lemony Snicket is that he's enigmatic. I think it would have worked well for if it were 100 pages, but it was about 300, and that was just a bit too much of not really getting that much information. I read Pippi Longstocking for my module. Didn't like it when I was younger, I didn't like it now. I think Pippi Longstocking is just quite an annoying character, and it's so funny because in our class it was very split 50-50. Half of us loved Pippi Longstocking and half of us really didn't like her. So I'm interested, do you like Pippi Longstocking? I think I like the idea of her, but reading her, I actually find her very infuriating. I also read Ottoline Goes to School. Alright, it really is starting to get dark now, so I think I'm going to switch to better lighting tomorrow. Alright, it's the next day and I'm just going to be picking up where I left off. I also got myself a mug of Earl Grey rooibos tea. This is the Dragonfly one, which is my favourite. Next, I read the selected letters of Cicero. Cicero's letters are some of the most important historical letters. They inform a lot of the genre. Letters that people would then write thousands of years later. I particularly love Cicero's letters to his close friend Atticus, and one thing which I found really cool, especially when I was reading, I read maybe like 10-15 essays about Cicero's letters afterwards, just so I could better understand them. And one of the things I find so cool is how these letters help us to understand how letters were actually posted. Like, it was really easy for Cicero to send letters, and I don't think we expect that. We expect for postal services to have been not very good, but they were actually really good, and sometimes letters would travel 50 miles a day. They were good. Also, they're so wide-ranging. Letters obviously are, and it's really hard to pin down features of letters because they're just so different. Depending on circumstances, they are obviously going to be so different. They're as different as conversation, and Cicero's letters are no different. Some of them are very funny, some of them are incredibly sad. Then I read Angela Duckworth's book Grit, the Power of Passion and Perseverance, which looks into the psychology of grit, the science of grit, how we can become grittier people, how we can be more determined, resilient. It was a really useful book. I learnt a lot. I came away with a lot of takeaways. On postal cultures, I read Posting It, The Victorian Revolution in Letter Writing by Catherine J. Golden, which was excellent. Like, this is one of the best non-fiction books I read this year. It was so great. If you're into postal reform, if you find postal reform interesting, then you'll love this. It goes through and it tells you like what the postal service was like before the penny post and like a universal postage service in London, and then the impact that this had on posting letters. Next, I read The Boy at the Back of the Class. I'd heard so much about this. Is a middle grade book and it was recommended on my children's literature module. I think the kids in the book are year 3 or year 4, and a new child joins the class who is a refugee. It shows the speaker and their friends becoming friends with this boy. Honestly, it's so heartwarming. It's really beautifully done, very sensitive, and it's a great book, again, for teaching kids about the refugee crisis. I read Enigmas Historical and Geographical. Wait, I can't even remember the context of this. It's definitely Victorian. Wait, I'm going to just get up my notes on this to remind myself. Yes. So this book was referenced when I was reading about riddles and their role in Victorian society. Lewis Carroll used a lot of riddles and puzzles in his letters and in his books, and I was reading an essay on this, and in the essay it mentioned this book, Enigmas Historical and Geographical, which was a book of puzzles and riddles, which was published in the Victorian period. So I was interested to read it, and I tried out some of the riddles which were in there, which were actually really hard. I wasn't very good at them. I read Why Don't Students Like School by Daniel T. Willingham. It's by a cognitive scientist, and it's looking at the psychological reasons why children end up not enjoying school. This is something I'm very interested in. This book particularly, though, I didn't get on with the writing style all that well. I didn't think it was that engaging. I was still interested by his argument. I read Rooftoppers by Catherine Rundell, again for the children's literature module, and this was excellent. This is kind of YA stroke middle grade, and it's just so funny and absurd. It's about a girl called Sophie who lives with the most eccentric thespian parents, and then in a big turn of events, something happens and she has to move to Paris, and he meets the Rooftoppers, who are children who live on the roofs of Paris. It's just such a great idea for a book, and I really liked it. Then I reread Skellig by David Armand, which I read when I was about 12, and I haven't reread since, and it was really great to read again now. I love how lyrical David Armand is. I think he's a really great writer. He also wrote My Name is Mina, which I read this year too, and personally I prefer My Name is Mina. She's one of my favourite characters in literature. I just think she's so cool, and I love how she stands up to the education system, the flaws of the education system, and how she plays with words in really interesting ways, and is just curious about the world. Completely forgot to add My Name is Mina in last year. It wasn't in my list, so I actually read 118 books, which is a little bit close to my goal, which is great. Next, I read Sugar by Jewel Parker Rhodes, which is narrated by a girl on a sugar plantation. It's a really beautiful story. I read Loveless by Alice Oseman, which people say this is, one of their favourite books, but I personally didn't enjoy it that much. I really love what it's trying to do, like raising awareness of asexuality, which isn't spoken about very much, honestly, especially in literature. But I don't like how the only notable thing about Georgia's character is that she's not in a relationship and that she doesn't want to be in a sexual relationship, and as a result I just feel like she's quite one-dimensional, and that it would have been nice to see more interesting character from her outside of her sexuality. I read The Haunting of the Snark by Lewis Carroll, which is another of his books for children, which is very funny. It's very short, and it's about this expedition this ship is on to try and find a snark, which is this imaginary animal. I read Only Ever Yours by Louise O'Neill, which is again for the children's module, and this was terrible. Oh my gosh, this is 1 star, like probably the worst book I read this year. Interesting what it's trying to do. It's a dystopian book, and it's like a school of girls who are being raised so that they can best please like their future husbands and men. I kind of like what it's doing, but it just feels like so little happens in the space of this book. Like, all of it's world building. The whole book is world building, and I kept on expecting for something to happen or like things to change, but they just didn't. And for a long book, I think it's like 300 or 400 pages, it just does not feel worth it. I feel like you get everything you're going to get out of this book in the first 50 pages. However, I did read The Disreputable History of Frankie Landau Banks by E. Lockhart, who also wrote We Were Liars, and that was excellent. One of the best books I read this year. Frankie Landau Banks is such a cool character. She learns about this secret society at her boarding school, which is only for boys, and she wants to be part of it, but she can't because she's a girl. And so to make a point, she starts rivaling them, like it's her versus this secret society, and she basically does their activities better than them. Oh, it's just brilliant. She's such a great character. Next, I read How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. Again, listen to this as an audiobook. The title, honestly, is so funny. This is a really influential self-help book from the 1950s, and I've heard about it so much. Like, it's so prevalent in pop culture and has been so influential. So I wanted to read it. I wanted to see what it said. I read Death in the Victorian Family by Pat Jalland. I particularly loved the part on morning dress. Then I reread Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, obviously for my dissertation. The Universe in a Handkerchief is about the magic tricks that Lewis Carroll did, and also interesting puzzles that he created, specifically how this corresponds with his interest in maths, because of course he was a maths tutor at Oxford for most of his life. Then I read The Letters of Lewis Carroll, as I say. I actually only read in full Volume 1. I didn't read in full Volume 2. I read about 2/3 of Volume 2, so I only put Volume 1 on. But they are hefty volumes. They're like this thick and they're this wide. In total, I think the whole thing, both volumes, is like 1,600 pages. I read The Life and Letters of Lewis Carroll by Stuart Dodgson Collingwood, which is like a biography of Lewis Carroll's life. Then I read Sylvie and Bruno by Lewis Carroll, which is a much longer children's book that he wrote. I think it's his longest one, and it's the misadventures of these two children, Sylvie and Bruno. Didn't like that one as much. It's not my favourite, the things that he's written. I read The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. Very interesting kind of self-help book on using money wisely, recognising that money is all about psychology, because it's humans who are using it. It can't be reduced down to mathematical formulas, and it just really helped me understand economics a bit better because I don't know much about that. I read Heartstopper as well this year and really enjoyed that. Read that off in combination with the show which came out. I just love how real it is as well. Like it feels very feasible. It feels like something that could happen. It feels like a real school. Oh, actually it is 117 books. I accidentally put Cicero's Letters twice, so I didn't read it twice, I read it once. I read Once Again to Zelda, The Stories Behind Literature's Most Intriguing Dedications by Marlene Wagman-Galler, which takes 50 different book dedications and then it looks at the stories behind them, thinking about the relationships which inspire particular authors, and just like giving books backstories and giving books stories, which is something I'm really interested in as a concept. These physical books have stories, and like the idea of a book has a story too. One of the books mentioned in Once Again to Zelda was The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. Joan Didion's husband and daughter both died really close together, and this book is about the year after this, how she dealt with the grief. Very moving. Sherwood Anderson's collected short stories I read next. I loved Winesburg, Ohio. Didn't like the short stories as much, and some of them in particular I really did not like. He's got a very stereotypically masculine voice, but some of them I did really like, because I do like that period, 1950s rural America writing. I read At the Bay by Catherine Mansfield, which is a short story. It's like all set on a beach, and I really like how it explores the division between child and adult, and this idea that once you grow up, you can't go back. I read A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. I can't believe it took me this long to read it. I loved this book so much. One of the best books I read this year. It's an essay about women in writing and why most of the great classics historically were written by men. If you do not have a room of your own to write in, if you've got responsibilities which don't allow you to write, then you can't eternalize your voice on paper. I think it's such a great argument and so applicable still today. I read The Aerial Poems by Sylvia Plath as well. These are her darkest poems and my favourites of her poems as well. Frost in May by Antonia White was excellent. Really loved this. I am going to start talking more quickly about the books as well, because I don't want this video to be too long. This happened last time as well. I start talking about them and then I'm like, oh, actually, I think I'm going to go more quickly. It's about a girl, Nanda, and her experience in convent school, thinking about how her disposition towards Catholicism changes over the course of her life and as she gets older. And so it's kind of a coming of age story, because you start to see the development of her own mind and her own belief system, which I think the book does it really well, because you start with her at age 9 and then you track her all the way up to when she finishes the school. And the changes in her are so massive, but it's so quietly and sensitively and minutely done. White Bird by R.J. Palacio, a Wonder spin-off. It's a graphic novel, and the story of Julian's grandmother during the Holocaust. Beautiful story of kindness. Murder in the Age of Enlightenment, Essential Stories. I really loved. Also, the cover is beautiful. And all the stories were really different in this collection, which I think is quite nice, because it means that you can dip into it depending on your mood and read a different story depending on your mood. Family of Lies by E. Lockhart was so great. Oh my gosh, this is the prequel to We Were Liars, and I loved We Were Liars so much. Like, I think it trends on TikTok for a reason. This is looking at the parents of the characters in We Were Liars, and again, One Fateful Summer, exploring privilege and also feminism in this one, which is really cool. I read finally A Room with a View by E.M. Forster, which I started in 2021 but didn't finish. I really didn't like this book that much. I thought it was really slow. I thought it was quite boring. I liked the parts in Italy, but I didn't like the parts in England. I mean, I like Forster's writing style, just the story of this I thought was too boring. Call Me By Your Name by Andrea Esselman. I reread this year because I was in Italy and I really wanted to reread the book in Italy. It's so lyrical, really beautifully done. Some passages of this I do find too graphic. I'm not too big a fan of reading sexually graphic literature. That's just personal preference for me. I read All the Bright Places by Jennifer Niven. This is a YA book. You've got this girl who's very popular and then this boy who is very unpopular, and they're both depressed and they both kind of find each other and they develop a really close relationship. I really loved the story, but I didn't like the writing style. The Snows of Kilimanjaro by Ernest Hemingway I read. I actually read quite a few of his short stories from a collection of them that I have. I'm not being very positive at all with a lot of these. I actually didn't really like reading Hemingway. I think it was maybe at the time that I read them I wasn't in the mood for them, but I didn't enjoy Hemingway as much as I thought I would, and as much as I've enjoyed others of his stories. Ocean Sea by Alessandro Baricco, an Italian book, kind of magical realism. It's very lyrical, very beautifully written. Some of it I was a little bit confused as to what was actually happening, and it's very interpretative and very metaphorical, and some parts are confusing for that reason, but I like it for the ideas and like the bits of philosophy and the thoughts that it invokes in you, as opposed to the actual story. I'd recommend this one though. If you like Call Me By Your Name and the writing style of that, then you'll probably like Ocean Sea. The Binding by Bridget Collins is one of the best books that I read this year. I thought it was brilliant. The concept is excellent, so interesting. It's about a world where books are made and abound from actual people's stories. So in order for a book to be made, you have to take the memories of somebody and put it in the book. Such a great concept, and the writing style lives up to the idea as well. Other Minds, The Octopus, the Sea and the Deep Origins of Consciousness by Peter Godfrey Smith is an exploration into cephalopods. It taught me so much about cephalopods. Octopuses are my favourite animals, and so it's really interesting, and also it poses an argument about what it means for an animal to be intelligent, and Godfrey Smith basically argues that it's all about curiosity, which I just think is a really great definition of intelligence. I liked that argument. Friends Like These by Meg Rossoff, kind of in the tradition of The Great Godin, like they're in the same editions and fairly similar in writing style and kind of audience that it's directed towards. I didn't like this one as much though. A girl gets an internship in New York, a single, really dank apartment room in New York without any air conditioning, and then she becomes best friends with this girl who's very rich, and she goes and stays with her in her family's penthouse, and it's just again examining ideas of privilege and I guess how their relationship is able to exist with that dichotomy of wealth. Night Shift by Debbie Glory is a picture book which is about depression and trying to help kids understand depression. I thought the illustrations in this were really excellent. This is Vegan Propaganda by Ed Winters. I loved it debunks a lot of the myths about veganism and taught me a lot. I definitely refer to this and facts about this when I have conversations about veganism with people. I read Paradise Regained by John Milton. I love John Milton so much. He's one of my favourite early modern writers. I prefer him to Shakespeare. Paradise Lost is my favourite thing he's written. I think it's his most famous book for a reason, but I did like Paradise Regained. I read The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd when I was in Scotland, which is about Nan Shepherd's experiences on the Cairngorm Mountains and kind of semi-gives advice on hiking. But I think the really great thing about it is the nature writing, and it captures Scotland so well and the Scottish Highlands so well. It's a great book to read while I was there. I read Why I Am So Clever by Friedrich Nietzsche, which is just one of the little Penguin black classics. It has a selection of his essays in there. Then I read A Day with Keats by May Clarissa Gillington Bryan, and she basically uses sources to construct a possible day that John Keats would have spent. I really enjoyed reading it. Then I read The Betrayals by Bridget Collins, which wasn't as good as The Binding, but I also love her writing style, and I'm really glad that I read this, and I would recommend it if you like The Binding. It's set in a school for adults though, so it's more like a university. They practice this thing called the grand jeu, which is this musical, mathematical practice, like this kind of art, which is able to tell stories. Then I read Plato's Symposium, one of his most seminal texts, definitely worth a read. Courage Calls to Courage Everywhere is an essay by Jeanette Winterson about female suffrage. It was published in 2018 to mark 100 years of female suffrage. Then I read The Gifts by Liz Hyder, set in Victorian London. It's about 4 women who grow angel wings on their backs, and it's looking at how Enlightenment society responds to this, and how it's medicalised. One of the characters, for example, is a surgeon. It's set in the 1840s when surgery and amputation was a really big thing, and that character is like he wants to amputate the wings. Then I read Once by Maurice Gleitzman, which again is a great educational book about the Holocaust for children. I read Genesis, first book of the Bible. Then I read The Synoptic Problem by William R. Farmer. The synoptic problem is a problem in theology. So there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Most scholars will say that that is a source cue which the Gospels used when writing the Gospels, but we don't know where it came from. It was an interesting book and it helped me understand more about this, which at the time was just something I was really interested in. The Outsider by Albert Camus I loved so much. It's an existential piece of fiction, and yeah, I would highly recommend it. Then I read Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, which again is quite graphic, but not as graphic as I was expecting it to be. Very, very progressive, very ahead of its time, considering this was published in the 1920s. It's about a relationship between this upper-class woman and the groundskeeper. I read Genius and Ink, Virginia Woolf on How to Read, which is a selection of essays by Virginia Woolf about both the act of writing and reading and specific authors like Shakespeare, Milton. I read The Lady of the Lake by Walter Scott, which is an epic poem. Again, read this in Scotland. Walter Scott isn't my favourite poet, I've got to say. How to Kill Your Family by Bella McKee was so excellent, so clever. The character is so awful, honestly. I really do not like her. I've got to be so quick because we're about to go out and I said I will get this done in the next 10 minutes. Okay. Then I read The Novel Anew, A Novelist's Guide to Writing Better Fiction by Rosalind Brackenbury, which was quite a basic guide to writing, but I also did learn something. When I was in America, I read The Complete Poems of Emily Dickinson whilst I was working at the museum. She's my favourite poet. I love this. I also read Open Me Carefully, Emily Dickinson's Intimate Letters to Susan Huntington Dickinson, which are beautiful letters. It collects some of Emily Dickinson's to Sue, and they are just so, like, they're so tender and intimate, and if you like Emily Dickinson, if you like her poetry, these are the best letters I think you can read by her. I also read Little Women by Louisa May Alcott whilst I was in Concord visiting the Louisa May Alcott house. Then I read The Complete Grimm's Fairy Tales because I wanted to understand some more about fairy tales and early children's literature. I'd never read the whole of them as well. Who Could That Be at This Hour is another Lemony Snicket book, which I enjoyed but not as much as the series of Unfortunate Events books. I read Holding It Together by Christina Buckton, which is her first poetry collection. It recently came out. One of the best anthologies that I've read. Honestly, I would highly recommend you reading this. The author is in her 90s now, and poems kind of start with her in childhood and thoughts about childhood, and then we see her kind of growing up within the poems and see how her thoughts change, and it's just the way it's curated as well as the actual poems is just so, like, it's amazing. I read Calypso by David Sedaris, which is a selection of short stories, very witty. He's a writer for The New Yorker and I really love his writing. Wait, The Myth of Atlas and Heracles by Jeanette Winterson is a Greek myth retelling, and I really love her interpretation of this. Sorry, back to the version which does not have as good lighting, but I'm actually just going to do the last 10 books right now. So most of these are Christmas books because these were all from December. I read A Literary Christmas, an anthology by the British Library, which is a compendium of lots of literature about Christmas. You've got extracts from Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, Charles Dickens, it's got poetry, and everything's separated into a different section. So you've got Christmas Eve, St. Nicholas, New Year's Eve, Cold Weather and Snow, and it's just such a delightful thing to dip into. I read it every year. I read The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse by Charlie Mackesy, which is one of my favourites. And also these are books that I read during a readathon, so I'm not going to go into that much depth. But I read The Frost Fair by Natasha Hastings. This is set in the 1600s when the Thames would freeze over and they would create fairs on the ice. Stalls would be set up there. They sound magnificent, they sound absolutely wonderful. But basically the book is set at the Frost Fair. So it's about a girl whose brother has died. She is met by this peculiar figure who says that he can bring him back to life. So every night he comes and collects her and takes her onto the ice to this alternate Frost Fair. It's this magical Frost Fair which is filled with spirits. She needs to go to the Frost Fair every night if she is to get her brother back. I read Christmas, A History by Judith Flanders, which I didn't particularly like that much, but it gives a history of Christmas. Then A Christmas Cornucopia by Mark Forsyth, which was excellent. Mark Forsyth is such a funny writer, really witty, really clever. He speaks on BBC Radio 4 a lot. Then A Christmas Memory by Truman Capote, exploring the distinction between adult and child, especially in the context of Christmas. Then I reread The Nutcracker. I also read Beyond the Wand, The Magic and Mayhem of Growing Up a Wizard by Tom Felton, which is his recent memoirs, and I wasn't sure if I was going to like this. There's always a danger with celebrity memoirs because I like Tom Felton, but I didn't know if I would like his writing. But I was very surprised, very honest. The main things that the book charts are his time in Harry Potter. It gives a very in-depth insight and overview of what it was like to work on Harry Potter sets, and so many of the things were just, it was different to what I was anticipating. Like, Tom wasn't always on set, he wasn't homeschooled, he was going into normal school every other week, which was really baffling to me. I really liked that so many of my preconceptions about what it was like to film Harry Potter were completely debunked. And then the second part of the book is a lot to do with his experience with addiction. Then I read The Chimes by Charles Dickens. This is a little bit like the New Year's version of A Christmas Carol. It's very similar. Like with his Christmas writings, and actually like with most of Dickens's work, it's filled with excessive, delightful, incredible descriptions and like lists of things which are always just so, like, they always feel so decadent and comforting to read. Particularly I really loved how he personified the old and the new year. I thought that was really well done. But it's not my favourite Dickens I've read, and if you're going to read that or A Christmas Carol, then you should definitely read A Christmas Carol. I also reread Emily Dickinson's letters because I was annotating one for a friend for Christmas. Then I read The Waves by Virginia Woolf. Oh my gosh, my throat is really hurting. I love Virginia Woolf. Whenever I read her, I wonder why I don't read her more. The Waves follows, I think is it 5 or 6 friends, and it starts with them in infancy when they are spending all of their time together, and then it charts them over the course of their lives, mainly narrated by Bernard, who goes on to be a journalist and becomes very dissociated, and I guess you'd best call him an observer of the world. And you just see how the characters change, how they drift apart, how child becomes adult, becomes elderly. Virginia Woolf was quite young when she wrote this, and yet it feels like you're listening to someone who is like 60 or 70 years old and reflecting on what it means to be young and what it means to be old. The really great thing about this, though, the thing that I love, is that the whole thing is told partially in relation to one single day. Between each life stage, you have a segment of a description of the beach and where the sun is in the sky and what's happening to the waves, and this just works as a perfect allegory and metaphor for what's happening to the characters at that stage. It's just so clever, and I really liked it. Then I read The Black Monk by Anton Chekhov, which is the first thing by Chekhov that I've read, and I loved it. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this. It was really short. It was a really small book. I was going up to London and I wasn't bringing a very big bag, so I just took this so that I'd have something to read, and I was shocked. I was reading it on the train and just was not expecting like how much I loved it. Just so poetic and philosophical that I'm not even really going to tell you anything. I'm just going to say read it. Sorry, that's a cop-out. Then I read The Fir Tree by Hans Christian Andersen, which is very short. Never read it before, actually. I reread A Christmas Carol on Christmas Eve. This is a book I read every year. And then the final book I read of the year was Tales of the Peculiar by Ransom Riggs, which is an accompaniment to Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children series. Works a little bit like the Tales of the Beadle and the Bard in Harry Potter, where Tales of the Peculiar is a book of fairy stories which the characters in the book series read, and Ransom Riggs has written up these stories, and I loved them. I loved them much more than the Tales of the Beadle and the Bard, because each of them follows a peculiar character, someone who is different, and kind of like a moral lesson which they learn. It actually reminds me a lot of Tim Burton's The Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy, if you've read that. I'm just going to let you know now the books that I read which I didn't date, so I don't, like, they're not in order anymore. Of course I read I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy. I really loved Jeanette McCurdy when I was younger, so of course I wanted to read her memoirs, and they were heartbreaking. So raw, so honest. I read The Feminine Gospels poems by Carol Ann Duffy, which, again, loved this anthology so much, one of the best anthologies I've read. It's all about female experience, but it takes so many different aspects of female experience. It's very relatable. You feel very seen reading it as a woman. My mum and I read them together when we were in Scotland. I read The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold by Evelyn Waugh. Then I read The Secret History, which is the best book I read this year. I can't believe it took me this long to read it. It's just so clever, so well written. Like, I love the dark academia feel of it. Like, everything about it was just excellent. I cannot fault it, and I can't wait to read The Goldfinch this year. I read The Solitude poems by the Everyman Pocket Poets, my favourite anthologies. They're just really great collections, and they've got a wide range of poems in them. A children's literary Christmas anthology I read. This is like the adult British Library one, apart from they're all selections from children's books. Then I read A New Adventure, the Magic Faraway Tree book by Jack Wilson, because I used to love Jack Wilson and I loved The Magic Faraway Tree, so when I heard about this I pre-ordered it immediately. To be honest, I didn't really like it. It felt nostalgic to read it, but it just did not compare at all to the original. Then I read Dancing Fish and Ammonites, a memoir by Penelope Lively, which is all about growing old and what it's like to be old, which I found very interesting. I read I Captured the Castle by Dodie Smith. Again, loved this book so much. It was so great. I love how domestic it is, and feels, again, very nostalgic, captures the child voice very well. It felt very cozy. It felt like a warm hug reading it. It's set in this, it's about a family who lives in a castle, but they don't have much money at all, so they barely have enough to eat, but they live in this like elaborate castle with a moat and 2 swans, and the whole thing is the diary of the girl who lives there. Then I think the final book that I read this year was If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio, again a dark academia book, which I loved. Didn't love it as much as The Secret History. I read it directly afterwards, which was probably a mistake, but I still loved it. I love how basically half the book is told through Shakespeare quotes. I know that some people think have said this is very pretentious, and I mean, I guess it's slightly pretentious, but also I think it's really cool, and I love how it's framing Shakespeare as something very relevant, very real. Like, Shakespeare does capture human experience very well, and his plays are still, like, continue to be very accurate in helping us understand what it means to be human. Just because they're from the 1600s doesn't mean that they don't accurately show human emotion, and I think the book just does very well to emphasise that Shakespeare is still relevant, he is still important, because the lines from his plays are able to fit into a very modern situation and environment. I just think it's really cool. I love what it did. Anyway, those are all of the books I read this year. I really hope you enjoyed watching, and I apologise because I said this video wouldn't be very long and then I know that it will be. But thank you again for watching, and I hope that you have a productive week.